The master saw the slave comfort his autistic son, and his heart stirred with an emotion he had never expected to feel. In the antebellum South, where rigid hierarchies defined every interaction, one unexpected connection threatened to shatter a lifetime of beliefs. A desperate father, unable to reach his own child, was about to discover that compassion knows no boundaries of status or race. What happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about humanity, fatherhood, and the very souls of those he owned. Master Jonathan Caldwell stood at the window of his grand plantation house, watching his 8-year-old son Thomas rock back and forth beneath the oak tree. The boy's hands flapped frantically at his sides, a sight that filled Jonathan with a mixture of love, confusion, and crushing shame. The golden Georgia sunlight caught in Thomas's sandy hair, so like his mother's, making the boy appear almost angelic from a distance. It was only up close that others noticed his vacant stare and peculiar movements. "He needs a firm hand, not your coddling," his father-in-law had declared on his last visit, his aristocratic nose wrinkled in disgust. "No grandson of mine should behave like a lunatic. The boy brings disgrace to both our families." Those words still burned in Jonathan's ears, especially since Eleanor's death during childbirth had left him to raise their unusual son alone. The portrait of his late wife hung in the study, her gentle eyes seeming to follow him with silent reproach, as if asking why he couldn't better help their child. Jonathan had consulted physicians from Charleston to Savannah. Each one offered different explanations: brain fever, maternal impression, nervous constitution. Some suggested institutions where such children were kept, hidden away from society. Jonathan had toured one such place and left retching in the garden, haunted by the hollow eyes of children strapped to beds. He would never condemn Thomas to such a fate. Thomas's screams pierced the afternoon air as a dinner bell rang unexpectedly from the kitchen house. Jonathan rushed outside, his polished boots leaving divots in the manicured lawn as he ran toward his son. He attempted to calm Thomas with the techniques the latest doctor had suggested: firm pressure on the shoulders, speaking in low, even tones. But Thomas only thrashed harder, his small body rigid with distress, his screams drawing the stares of field hands and house slaves alike. "Look away. Back to your work." Jonathan barked at the onlookers, humiliation burning his neck. He could read their thoughts in their carefully blank expressions. How could a man who couldn't control his own flesh and blood possibly command respect as master of Willowbrook Plantation? Thomas's fingers clawed at his own face, leaving angry red marks. Jonathan caught his wrists, trying to still the self-harm while maintaining his dignity. The boy's strength was surprising, fueled by a panic Jonathan couldn't comprehend. What terrors lived inside his son's mind that made ordinary sounds unbearable tortures? "I'm trying, Eleanor," Jonathan whispered, tears threatening to spill as he carried his thrashing son inside, away from judging eyes. "God help me. I'm trying." The whispers from neighboring plantation owners had already begun at the last county gathering. That the Caldwell bloodline had weakened, that Jonathan couldn't control his own household, let alone his slaves. Some even suggested he remarry quickly to produce a proper heir before Thomas became his legacy. That night, after Thomas finally exhausted himself into fitful sleep, Jonathan sat alone in his study with a glass of bourbon. The isolation of his position weighed on him like chains. A widower with a son no one understood, running a plantation that demanded unwavering strength. He had no one to confide in, no shoulder upon which to rest his burdens. The Southern gentleman's code demanded he bear it all with stoic resolve, never revealing the cracks in his foundation. But what Jonathan didn't know was that someone had been watching. someone who understood his son in ways he never could. And this understanding would soon challenge everything Jonathan believed about his world and his place within it. Isaac moved silently through the big house before dawn, lighting lamps and stoking fires as the plantation stirred to life. At 35, he'd spent 2 decades as property of the Caldwell family, his powerful frame and quick mind making him valuable first in the fields, then as a house servant, unlike many slaves who wore masks of subservience. Isaac's dignity remained intact beneath his carefully controlled expressions. Years of practice had taught him to make himself nearly invisible, present enough to serve, absent enough to avoid notice. It was a delicate balance that had kept him alive, while others had been sold for lesser offenses than pride. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he navigated the familiar hallways of Willowbrook. The house itself seemed to breathe in the early morning darkness, expanding and contracting with the Georgia humidity, whispering secrets in the spaces between walls. Isaac knew every sound, every shadow. He knew which step would betray him with a groan, and which doors required extra oil to open silently. This knowledge was survival. He paused outside young Master Thomas's room, hearing the familiar sounds of distress. The boy was awake early again, rocking and humming that same repetitive tune, a melody without beginning or end. Isaac's hand hovered near the doorknob, frozen in indecision. The boy's cries pierced something deep within him, something he'd tried to bury after Benjamin was taken. Isaac hesitated, knowing his place. Slaves didn't enter the family quarters uninvited, especially not a male slave in a child's bedroom. But something about Thomas's cries resonated with Isaac in ways he couldn't explain. Through the crack in the door, Isaac could see Thomas rocking in the corner of his 4-poster bed, hands covering his ears, though no apparent sound disturbed the morning quiet. The boy's nightshirt was twisted around his small frame, damp with sweat despite the cool morning air. Isaac recognized the signs. The world itself was too loud for Thomas, even in silence. "You there, what are you doing?" Mrs. Hawkins, the housekeeper, appeared at the end of the hallway, her keys jangling at her waist like warnings. Her thin lips pressed into an even thinner line of disapproval. Though technically a servant herself, Mrs. Hawkins took particular pride in enforcing the boundaries between house slaves and the family. She'd been with the Caldwells since before Master Jonathan was born, and considered herself the moral guardian of Willowbrook's propriety. "Just checking if the young master needs anything, ma'am," Isaac replied, eyes downcast, his face assuming the blank expression expected of him. He kept his hands visible at his sides. A man of his size learned early to appear non-threatening to nervous white folk. "That's not your place." She sniffed, the scent of lavender water and self-importance trailing behind her as she approached. "Miss Abigail will tend to him when she arrives. Back to the kitchen now. Cook needs help with the breakfast preparations." Her tone left no room for argument, though her eyes held a hint of suspicion that Isaac knew could fester into something dangerous. Isaac nodded and retreated, but not before hearing Thomas's cries intensify as Mrs. Hawkins opened the door. The housekeeper's sharp "Control yourself, Master Thomas," followed him down the servants' staircase. Miss Abigail, the governess hired to manage Thomas, believed in harsh discipline for his willful behaviors. Isaac had seen the bruises on the boy's wrists where she restrained him during his episodes, had heard her lectures about driving out the willfulness, as if the child's differences were a form of deliberate disobedience. In the kitchen, Isaac went about his duties mechanically, his mind still upstairs with the distressed child. Cook noticed his distraction, but said nothing, merely handing him an extra biscuit with his morning portion. Small kindnesses were the currency among the household staff. never acknowledged aloud, but treasured nonetheless. Heard the young master having another spell. Cook murmured, her hands never pausing as she kneaded dough. Poor creature. Isaac merely nodded, knowing that even among slaves, conversations could be reported and punished. Cook had lost her own children to sale years ago. Perhaps she recognized something in Isaac's concern for the boy. Later that afternoon, Isaac was pruning roses in the garden when he spotted Thomas alone by the small pond, flicking his fingers before his eyes and watching the patterns they made against the sunlight. The boy seemed peaceful, entranced by something only he could see. His usual attendants were nowhere in sight, a rare moment of freedom for the closely watched child. The garden was Isaac's sanctuary, the one place on the plantation where he felt some measure of peace. Master Caldwell had recognized Isaac's gift with plants years ago and had gradually given him charge of the ornamental gardens. Here among the camellias and roses, Isaac could almost forget his status, could almost believe the dirt under his fingernails belonged to land he might someday call his own. Isaac continued his work, careful not to disturb Thomas. The afternoon sun filtered through the magnolia trees, casting dappled shadows across the manicured lawn. Bees hummed lazily among the flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird called to its mate. These moments of beauty were what Isaac held on to in his darkest hours, proof that God's creation continued regardless of man's cruelty. But when the dinner bell rang, sharp, insistent, cutting through the garden's tranquility, the boy began to scream and thrash, covering his ears as if the sound physically hurt him. Isaac glanced toward the house. No one was coming. Master Caldwell was meeting with cotton buyers in his study, and Miss Abigail was likely enjoying her afternoon tea in town, as was her Thursday custom. The other house slaves would be busy preparing for dinner, and the field hands were too distant to hear. Making a decision that could cost him dearly, Isaac approached Thomas slowly, crouching down several feet away. He remembered how he'd approached Benjamin during similar episodes: no sudden movements, no loud voices, maintaining distance until invited closer. "Young master," he said softly, not reaching for the boy. "The sound hurts your ears, doesn't it?" His voice was barely above a whisper, smooth as river stones. Thomas continued rocking, but his screams subsided slightly. His eyes darted toward Isaac and away again, never making direct contact, but acknowledging his presence nonetheless. Isaac remembered his own son, Benjamin, sold away 3 years ago to a plantation in Mississippi. Benjamin had been different too, not speaking until age 5, overwhelmed by certain sounds and textures, but possessing an extraordinary memory for numbers and patterns. Isaac's wife, Naomi, had been sold 2 years before that, leaving Isaac to care for their unusual child alone. He'd learned through trial and error how to soothe Benjamin's episodes, how to interpret his needs when words failed him. The memory of his son's face on that last day, confused, terrified as he was led away, threatened to overwhelm Isaac. He pushed it down, focusing instead on the child before him. This boy might be white, might be the master's son, but in this moment he was simply a frightened child needing comfort. "My boy used to cover his ears too," Isaac said, keeping his voice low and rhythmic. "I found that if I hummed real low like this..." He began a deep, gentle humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground between them. It was an old song, one his grandmother had sung. A melody with roots in a homeland Isaac had never seen, but carried in his blood nonetheless. To Isaac's surprise, Thomas stopped rocking and tilted his head, listening. His eyes, usually unfocused, seemed to track the sound. Isaac continued the humming, maintaining distance but slowly opening his palm on the ground between them. The invitation was clear but undemanding. Connection offered, not forced. After several minutes that stretched like hours, Thomas placed his small white hand atop Isaac's weathered brown one. The contrast was stark, one hand soft and unmarked by labor, the other calloused and lined with years of forced work. Yet in this moment, they were simply two humans connecting across a divide far greater than race. Neither moved for a long moment. Then Thomas began to mimic Isaac's humming, matching the exact pitch and rhythm with uncanny precision. His usually distant eyes now focused intently on Isaac's mouth, studying the source of the sound. "That's right," Isaac whispered. "That sound is better than the bell, isn't it?" He slowly shifted his humming to a different key, and Thomas followed, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to hang in the garden air like the scent of jasmine. What neither realized was that Master Jonathan had returned early from his meeting and now stood frozen at the garden path, witnessing the impossible. His unreachable son, making deliberate contact with another human being. And not just any human, but a slave whom society deemed less than fully human. As Thomas's fingers curled around Isaac's, Jonathan felt something shift in his chest. A terrible, wonderful stirring that threatened everything he'd been raised to believe. The foundation of his world, the natural order that placed white above black, master above slave, trembled beneath this simple human connection. For 3 years, Jonathan had tried everything to reach his son, the best doctors, the strictest governesses, his own desperate attempts at connection. He'd prayed for a miracle, for some key to unlock his child's isolated world. And now, watching from the shadows of the garden path, he was witnessing that miracle through the gentle hands of a man he owned but did not know. Thomas laughed, a sound so rare that Jonathan nearly gasped aloud. The boy was now fully engaged with Isaac, their humming creating patterns that seemed to delight Thomas. Isaac had produced a leaf and was showing the boy how the veins created patterns, and Thomas was tracing them with a focus Jonathan had never seen before. Jonathan stepped back, unnoticed, his mind reeling with implications. To acknowledge what he was seeing would mean questioning everything, his role as master, the very system that gave him privilege and power. Yet to ignore it would be to deny his son the first real connection he'd found in his short, isolated life. As the sun began its descent behind the oak trees, casting long shadows across Willowbrook's manicured grounds, Jonathan Caldwell stood at a crossroads he'd never anticipated. Before him lay a choice between the world as he'd been taught it was, and the world as it might be. A choice between preserving the social order and saving his son. And in the garden, oblivious to the monumental decision being weighed, a slave and a child continued their humming, building a bridge across an unbridgeable divide. Jonathan retreated to his study, his mind in turmoil. The crystal decanter of bourbon beckoned, but he ignored it. He needed clarity tonight, not the comfortable fog of alcohol. The leather chair creaked beneath him as he sank into it, staring unseeing at the plantation ledgers spread across his mahogany desk. Columns of numbers and names, profits and property intertwined in the economic reality that sustained Willowbrook. Each figure represented human labor, human suffering transformed into cotton bales and currency. The image of Thomas's hand on Isaac's played over and over in his mind. His son, his withdrawn, unreachable son, had connected with someone. Not with him, not with any of the expensive specialists, but with a slave. The implications were staggering, threatening to upend everything Jonathan had been raised to believe about natural hierarchies and proper social order. Outside his window, twilight descended on the plantation. Oil lamps flickered to life in the slave quarters, distant pinpricks of light in the growing darkness. Jonathan found himself wondering, for the first time, what happened in those small cabins after work ended. What stories were told, what skills passed down, what knowledge preserved despite every attempt to strip it away. What did Isaac do in those hours? Did he think of his lost son, dream of reunion, nurse private grief that no master would ever acknowledge? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, straightening his posture and composing his features into the mask of authority expected of him. Mrs. Hawkins appeared, her perpetual frown deepened by concern. Her gray hair was pulled back severely beneath her cap, not a strand out of place despite the long day's work. She had been with the Caldwell family since before Jonathan was born, and sometimes he felt she still saw him as the mischievous boy he'd once been, rather than master of Willowbrook. "Master Caldwell, I must speak with you about Thomas's behavior at dinner," she said, clasping her hands before her crisp apron. Jonathan sighed. What happened? He refused to eat again, sir. Threw his plate when Miss Abigail insisted. "The new Limoges china, sir. One plate completely shattered." She clicked her tongue in disapproval. "And—" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if to ensure they weren't overheard. He kept making that strange humming sound. Miss Abigail couldn't get him to stop. "Most disturbing to the household rhythm, sir." Jonathan felt a flicker of something. Was it hope? At the mention of the humming. The sound that had formed a bridge between Thomas and Isaac had persisted, had traveled from garden to dining room. "Where is he now?" "Miss Abigail has confined him to his room for the evening. She believes firm discipline." "That will be all, Mrs. Hawkins," Jonathan interrupted, rising from his chair with sudden decision. "Please inform Miss Abigail I wish to see her tomorrow morning. I'll check on Thomas myself." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly at this deviation from routine, but she knew better than to question her employer. "Yes, sir. Will you require anything else this evening?" "No, thank you. Okay, you may retire once the kitchen is settled." After she left, Jonathan paced the study, his shadow elongating and contracting against the book-lined walls with each turn. The plantation system had clear rules about who was master and who was slave, about how children should behave and be raised. His father and grandfather would have handled Thomas's condition with strict discipline and, if that failed, discreet institutionalization. The Caldwell name had to be protected, the bloodline preserved from whispers of weakness or defect. But Jonathan had seen something in the garden that challenged everything. A connection, a breakthrough. And deep in his heart, wasn't Thomas's well-being more important than social propriety? Wasn't his son's happiness worth more than maintaining appearances at county gatherings? The portrait of Eleanor seemed to watch him from above the fireplace. Would she have had the courage to defy convention for their son? Jonathan liked to believe she would have. Eleanor had always possessed a gentleness that sometimes bordered on impropriety, treating house slaves with courtesy that raised eyebrows among neighboring plantation wives, questioning aspects of their society that others accepted without thought. "I'm trying to do right by him, Eleanor," Jonathan whispered to the painted eyes that could never answer. "But I don't know what right is anymore." He climbed the stairs to Thomas's bedroom, pausing outside the door. No sounds came from within, no humming, no rocking, no distressed cries. The silence was somehow more worrying than any outburst. Gently, he turned the handle and entered. Thomas sat by the window in his nightshirt, tracing patterns on the glass with his finger, his reflection ghostly in the darkness. The moonlight silvered his sandy hair and cast half his face in shadow. He didn't acknowledge his father's presence, continuing his methodical tracing, as if alone. "Thomas," Jonathan said softly, approaching slowly as he'd seen Isaac do. "Son." The boy continued his tracing, lost in his private world. Jonathan sat on the window seat beside him, careful to maintain distance. He watched his son's fingers move in precise, repeating patterns across the glass. Circles within circles, lines that doubled back on themselves. Was there meaning in these patterns? Some language Jonathan couldn't decipher? Then, hesitantly, Jonathan began to hum, trying to recreate the low, vibrating sound he'd heard Isaac make in the garden. His attempt was poor, his baritone too formal, too controlled. The sound felt foreign in his throat, unnatural to a man raised to speak with authority rather than gentle resonance. Thomas's hand paused, his head tilted slightly. Encouraged, Jonathan continued, closing his eyes to focus on the sound rather than the result he desperately wanted. He hummed lower, letting the vibration rumble in his chest as he'd observed Isaac doing. The melody, if it could be called that, was nothing like the classical compositions that occasionally played in the Caldwell parlor. It was earthier, simpler, yet somehow more profound, a communication beyond words. When he opened his eyes, Thomas was looking at him, not quite at his eyes, but at his mouth, the source of the sound. It wasn't the direct connection he'd seen in the garden, but it was something, more than he'd had before. Jonathan slowly extended his hand, palm up, as Isaac had done. Thomas returned to tracing the window, ignoring the offered hand. Jonathan's heart sank, but he kept humming, kept his hand extended. Minutes passed. His arm grew tired, but he refused to withdraw the invitation. The night deepened around them, the household settling into silence below. Finally, Thomas's fingers left the glass. But instead of taking his father's hand, he began to rock, distressed sounds building in his throat. Jonathan stopped humming immediately, recognizing the signs of overwhelm. "It's all right," he whispered, withdrawing his hand. "It's all right, Thomas. I'm not upset." The words felt inadequate, but he continued speaking softly, hoping his tone might convey what his words couldn't. He sat quietly until Thomas calmed, then reluctantly rose to leave. At the door, he paused, watching his son return to his window patterns. The breakthrough hadn't transferred to him. Whatever connection Isaac had found, Jonathan couldn't replicate it. The knowledge was both humbling and frightening. What if the only person who could reach his son was someone society deemed his inferior? Sleep eluded Jonathan that night. He lay awake in his large four-poster bed, the same bed where Eleanor had died, bringing Thomas into the world. The irony wasn't lost on him, that her death had given life to a child who now lived in a world largely of his own making. What would Thomas's future hold? Who would care for him when Jonathan was gone? The questions circled like vultures, denying him rest. By dawn, Jonathan had made his decision. Unconventional, potentially scandalous, but necessary. Thomas needed help that Jonathan couldn't provide, help that perhaps only Isaac could offer. The next morning, Jonathan summoned Isaac to his study. A highly unusual move that set the household buzzing with speculation. Mrs. Hawkins had raised her eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared beneath her cap, and Miss Abigail had pursed her lips in disapproval when she learned her meeting with the master had been delayed for a conversation with a slave. Isaac stood before the desk, eyes properly lowered, body tense with justified caution. His posture was perfect, respectful without being obsequious, a dignity maintained despite circumstances designed to strip it away. Jonathan noticed for the first time how Isaac held himself, the intelligence in his carefully controlled expression. "Isaac," Jonathan began, struggling to find the right words for a conversation with no precedent in his experience. "I observed you with my son yesterday." Isaac's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Master Caldwell." "You connected with him. How?" The question came out more demanding than Jonathan intended, his anxiety manifesting as authority. Isaac remained silent for a moment, clearly weighing his response. Every word from a slave to a master carried risk. Too forthright might be perceived as insolence, too deferential as hiding something. "I had a son once, Master. He was similar to young Master Thomas in some ways." "Similar? How?" Jonathan leaned forward, hunger for understanding overcoming his usual reserve. Isaac's eyes remained downcast, but his voice carried a depth of emotion he rarely allowed himself to reveal. He found certain sounds painful, didn't speak much, but he noticed things others didn't. Patterns, details. The way water rippled in a bucket, how light broke through tree leaves. "I learned how to reach him." "And where is your son now?" Jonathan asked, though he suspected the answer. Something in his chest tightened with preemptive guilt. "He was sold, Master, 3 years ago, to a plantation in Mississippi." The words were simple, unadorned, yet contained worlds of grief. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Jonathan felt a stab of discomfort. He'd approved countless slave sales over the years, never considering the families torn apart. Had he signed the paper authorizing the sale of Isaac's son? He couldn't remember. Such transactions blurred together in plantation ledgers, human beings reduced to inventory. "I want you to help Thomas," Jonathan said finally, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "Teach me what you know." Isaac looked up then, surprise momentarily overcoming years of trained deference. "Master?" "Not as his, not to replace Miss Abigail," Jonathan clarified hastily, aware of the social boundaries he was approaching. The idea of a slave serving as tutor to a planter's son was unthinkable, a violation of every social code. "But perhaps you could work in the garden when Thomas is there. Show me how you—" He gestured vaguely, uncomfortable with acknowledging he needed a slave's expertise. Isaac studied him, and for a brief moment, Jonathan felt the strange sensation of being evaluated by someone he owned. "The young master responds to rhythm, to patterns," Isaac said carefully. "He doesn't like to be touched unless he chooses it. Loud sounds hurt him. They're not just unpleasant, they cause him pain." Jonathan nodded, absorbing this knowledge that had eluded expensive doctors. Will you help him? Help me understand him?" "Yes, Master Caldwell," Isaac replied, his expression carefully neutral again, though something like hope flickered briefly in his eyes. As Isaac turned to leave, Jonathan added, "This arrangement remains between us. The household needn't know." The implications were clear. This breach of social protocol must remain hidden. The master's dependence on a slave's knowledge, a secret. Isaac nodded, understanding perfectly the shame Jonathan felt at seeking help from a slave. "I understand, Master." After Isaac left, Jonathan stared out the window toward the cotton field stretching to the horizon. Everything he owned, the land, the house, his position in society, rested on the institution of slavery, on the belief that men like Isaac were property, not people with knowledge and skills that might exceed his own. Yet for Thomas, he would risk it. For Thomas, he would learn from a slave. What Jonathan couldn't admit, even to himself, was that the arrangement served his conscience too. It allowed him to help Isaac without challenging the system that had taken Isaac's son. It let him feel benevolent without being revolutionary. The contradiction sat uneasily in his chest. How could he acknowledge Isaac's humanity in one breath while maintaining his enslavement in the next? That afternoon, Jonathan watched from his study window as Isaac worked in the garden. Thomas had been allowed outside after completing his lessons with Miss Abigail, who stood stiffly at the edge of the garden path, fan fluttering against the summer heat. When Thomas wandered near the roses where Isaac pruned, the governess started forward, but Jonathan had instructed her to allow the proximity. Isaac didn't approach Thomas, didn't speak to him directly. Instead, he began to hum as he worked, the sound carrying across the garden. Thomas continued his solitary pacing, but gradually his path brought him closer to Isaac. By the time Miss Abigail called Thomas in for his afternoon rest, the boy was sitting just a few feet from Isaac, watching intently as the gardener arranged cut roses by color gradient. Jonathan turned from the window, a complex mixture of emotions churning within him. Relief that Thomas had again responded to Isaac. Fear of what others might think should they notice the connection. And something deeper, more troubling. The first stirrings of doubt about the very foundation of the world he'd inherited. That evening, he penned a letter to a physician in Philadelphia who was said to have progressive ideas about children like Thomas. The letter sat unsealed on his desk until dawn, Jonathan unable to decide whether sending it would be an act of courage or betrayal. Of his class, his region, his ancestors. As summer heat settled over Willowbrook Plantation, 3 lives began to orbit each other in secret. A desperate father, a broken-hearted slave, and a boy trapped in his own mind. None of them could guess how their careful arrangement would be tested, or how the growing war clouds gathering over the nation would soon shatter their fragile connection. In Charleston, politicians spoke of secession with increasing fervor. In Boston, abolitionists published pamphlets that found their way even to southern plantations, hidden and read in secret. And in Washington, a tall, angular lawyer from Illinois was beginning a campaign that would eventually tear the nation apart. But at Willowbrook, for this brief moment, the only revolution was a private one. A master learning from a slave, a father reaching for his son, and a child finding his first tenuous connection to the world beyond his mind. August heat lay over Willowbrook like a sodden blanket. 2 months had passed since Jonathan's decision, and the secret arrangement continued. In the garden, away from curious eyes, Isaac worked with Thomas 3 times weekly while Jonathan observed, learning the subtle language of his son's world. "He likes order," Isaac explained one afternoon, watching Thomas arrange fallen camellia petals by shade. "Things need to make sense to him, even if it's a sense others don't see." Jonathan nodded, dabbing sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. The doctors called it fixation, said it was a sign of his deficiency. Isaac's expression remained neutral, but his hands paused briefly in their work. "My Benjamin was the same. He could count cotton bolls faster than any field hand, knew exactly how many were in a basket without counting aloud. Overseer thought he was insolent when he corrected the tallies." These moments of shared understanding had become more frequent, brief acknowledgments of their unusual alliance. Jonathan found himself hungry for Isaac's insights, not just about Thomas, but about the world as seen through different eyes. "Master Caldwell." Mrs. Hawkins's voice shattered the peaceful scene. She hurried down the garden path, her face flushed with more than heat. "You have visitors, sir. The Whitfields and Reverend Parker." Jonathan rose quickly. "I'll come at once." To Isaac, he added quietly, "Continue with Thomas. I'll make excuses." In the parlor, Jonathan found his neighbors already helped to refreshments. Charles Whitfield, owner of neighboring Oak Ridge Plantation, rose to greet him. "Jonathan, we were beginning to think you'd abandoned society altogether." His jovial tone carried an undercurrent of curiosity. "Charles, Margaret," Jonathan nodded to each. "Reverend Parker, what brings you by on such a warm afternoon?" Margaret Whitfield's fan fluttered like an anxious bird. "We've hardly seen you in months, Jonathan. Not at church, not at the midsummer ball. People are talking." "I've been occupied with plantation matters," Jonathan replied smoothly. "And Thomas has been difficult." Reverend Parker leaned forward, his thin face somber. "That's partly why we've come, Jonathan. There are rumors concerning Thomas and one of your slaves." Jonathan felt ice form in his stomach despite the heat. "Rumors?" "Abigail Simmons mentioned it to my wife at the sewing circle," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a scandalized whisper. "She says you've allowed a field hand to interact with Thomas, that you watch them together." "Isaac is my head gardener, not a field hand," Jonathan corrected automatically, then cursed himself for confirming rather than denying. Charles Whitfield's eyebrows rose. "Then it's true?" "Good God, Jonathan, what are you thinking? Allowing a slave such liberties with your son?" "Thomas responds to him," Jonathan said stiffly. "He's shown improvement." "Improvement?" Reverend Parker's voice dripped with concern. "At what cost to his soul? To his understanding of natural order? These people may appear docile, Jonathan, but they harbor resentments. To allow one such influence over an impressionable child." "Isaac has a gift with Thomas," Jonathan interrupted. "He understands him in ways no physician or tutor has managed." Margaret's fan stopped abruptly. "You speak of him as if he were an equal." The room fell silent. Jonathan realized he'd crossed an invisible line, not just in action, but in speech. To acknowledge a slave's superior skill, to value their insight, was to undermine the very foundation of their society. "I speak of him as a useful tool in managing my son's condition," Jonathan said carefully. Nothing more. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He'd come to see Isaac as more than a tool, more than property. But to admit that would be dangerous. For himself, for Thomas, and especially for Isaac. Charles seemed mollified. But Reverend Parker studied Jonathan with narrowed eyes. "These are troubled times, Jonathan. Abolitionist sentiment grows stronger in the North. There's talk of a Republican presidential candidate who would destroy our way of life. We cannot afford to show any weakness, any crack in our resolve. I assure you, my commitment to our Southern institutions remains unshaken," Jonathan replied, the practiced words flowing easily despite his inner conflict. After the visitors departed, Jonathan stood alone in the parlor, their warnings echoing in his mind. The arrangement with Isaac was no longer secret. And in the charged political climate, even a private decision could have dangerous public consequences. That evening, as Jonathan sat with Thomas before bedtime, attempting the humming that sometimes bridged their worlds, he heard a soft knock. Isaac stood in the doorway, his expression grave. "Master Caldwell, may I speak with you?" Jonathan followed him into the hallway, closing Thomas's door. "What is it?" "There's talk in the quarters," Isaac said quietly, "about me working with young Master Thomas. Some say it's not right." "Not right? What do you mean?" Isaac's eyes met his briefly, then lowered. "Some think I'm being tested, that you'll punish me if the boy doesn't improve. Others say I'm trying to rise above my station." Jonathan hadn't considered how the arrangement might appear to the other slaves, the dangers it might create for Isaac among his own people. another layer of complexity in a situation already fraught with risk. "Do you want to stop?" Jonathan asked. Isaac was silent for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "The boy needs help, and—" He hesitated, then added softly, "Working with him reminds me of Benjamin." The admission hung between them, a personal truth rarely shared across the divide of master and slave. Jonathan nodded, unable to find appropriate words. "We'll continue then," he said finally, "but we must be more careful." As Isaac turned to leave, Jonathan added, "Isaac, thank you." The words were inadequate, inappropriate even. A master didn't thank his property. But Jonathan could no longer pretend their relationship remained within those prescribed boundaries. Isaac paused, surprise flickering across his features. "Good night, Master Caldwell," he said simply, and disappeared down the servants' staircase. Jonathan returned to Thomas's room, finding his son asleep, one hand still tracing patterns on his blanket, even in slumber. The boy seemed peaceful, his features softened in the lamplight. Outside, cicadas thrummed in the darkness, their rhythm rising and falling like the humming that now connected three unlikely allies. But beneath that familiar sound, Jonathan sensed something else. The distant rumble of approaching storm, of a world on the verge of violent change. He thought of Reverend Parker's warning about the Republican candidate, the rail splitter from Illinois, whose name was spoken with contempt in Southern parlors. Lincoln, a man who represented everything the South feared. Jonathan had never considered himself political. He managed his plantation, maintained his family's position, and left larger questions to others. But now, with Thomas's future entangled with Isaac's knowledge, with his own growing doubts about the system he'd inherited, neutrality seemed increasingly impossible. In Charleston, men spoke openly of secession should Lincoln win in November. War, the unthinkable possibility, hovered on the horizon. And if it came, what would become of Willowbrook? Of Thomas? Of Isaac? Jonathan blew out the lamp and stood in darkness, listening to his son's steady breathing. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where Thomas might thrive, where Isaac might find his son, where the rigid boundaries between them might dissolve. A dangerous dream in dangerous times. As he closed Thomas's door, Jonathan didn't notice the shadow at the end of the hallway. Miss Abigail, her thin figure rigid with disapproval, her mind already composing the letter she would send to her cousin in Charleston, a prominent member of the Citizens Committee known for their vigilance against abolitionist sympathizers. Some transgressions, she believed, required more than local correction. September brought no relief from the heat, but it did bring change to Willowbrook. Miss Abigail departed suddenly, citing a family emergency in Charleston. Jonathan, relieved to be free of her disapproving presence, hired a younger woman from Savannah, Miss Caroline Porter, whose gentle demeanor and progressive educational ideas seemed better suited to Thomas's needs. "I've read Dr. Howe's work with Laura Bridgman at the Perkins Institution," she told Jonathan during their interview. "I believe children like Thomas need patience and understanding, not correction." Jonathan was cautiously optimistic. "And you wouldn't object to unconventional methods if they proved beneficial?" Miss Porter's intelligent eyes studied him. "My concern is Thomas's well-being, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not bound by traditional approaches that have clearly failed him." It seemed too good to be true. An educated young woman with modern ideas, arriving just when needed. Jonathan didn't question his good fortune. He should have. On a golden afternoon in late September, Jonathan returned early from business in town, eager to share news with Isaac. The Philadelphia doctor had finally responded to his letter, suggesting treatments that aligned remarkably with what Isaac was already doing. Jonathan found Thomas and Miss Porter in the garden with Isaac. The three sat on a blanket beneath the magnolia tree, Thomas arranging colored stones in intricate patterns, while Miss Porter sketched in a notebook. Isaac knelt nearby, carefully pruning late-blooming roses and humming the melody that had become Thomas's comfort. The scene was domestic, peaceful, and utterly scandalous by Southern standards. A white woman and child sharing space with a slave, as if they were equals enjoying a picnic. "Miss Porter," Jonathan called sharply as he approached. "A word, please." She rose gracefully, seemingly unperturbed by his tone. "Thomas is having a wonderful afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. He's created the most fascinating patterns. I've been documenting them." Jonathan glanced at her notebook. Detailed drawings of Thomas's stone arrangements alongside observations about his behavior. It was exactly the kind of careful study he'd hoped for. Yet the setting made him deeply uneasy. "While I appreciate your dedication," he said quietly, leading her away from Isaac and Thomas, "there are certain proprieties that must be observed." "Proprieties?" Her eyebrows rose. "I was under the impression you wanted Thomas to continue his interactions with Isaac. You specifically mentioned it during my interview." "Yes, but—" Jonathan struggled to articulate the complex social boundaries she'd transgressed. "You shouldn't be sitting with them. Observing from a distance would be more appropriate." Miss Porter's expression cooled slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, I cannot properly document Thomas's progress without close observation. And frankly, maintaining artificial distance undermines the trust we're building." Her words echoed thoughts Jonathan had barely allowed himself to acknowledge. Still, her boldness alarmed him. "You're new to Georgia, Miss Porter. You may not fully understand our ways." "Perhaps I understand them too well," she replied evenly. "But I was hired to help Thomas, not to reinforce social customs that harm him." Before Jonathan could respond, a rider appeared on the main drive. Charles Whitfield, approaching at a gallop. His horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting urgent business. "Jonathan," he called, dismounting hastily. "Have you heard the news from Harper's Ferry?" "Harper's Ferry? No, what's happened?" Charles's face was flushed with excitement and fear. "An abolitionist raid. John Brown and a band of fanatics seized the federal arsenal 3 days ago. They were planning to arm the slaves for insurrection." Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. "Good God. Were they successful?" "No, thank Providence. Marines under Colonel Lee put them down. Brown's been captured." Charles wiped his brow, noticing Miss Porter for the first time. "Forgive me, ma'am. This isn't suitable conversation for ladies." Miss Porter's expression revealed nothing. "I'll return to Thomas," she said, nodding politely before walking back to the magnolia tree. Charles watched her go, then lowered his voice. "The Citizens Committee is calling an emergency meeting tonight. After this outrage, we must be vigilant against any abolitionist sentiment or activities that might unsettle our people." Jonathan nodded, though his mind raced with implications. "Of course. I'll attend." "Good man." Charles clapped him on the shoulder, then hesitated. "Jonathan, about your situation with Thomas and that slave. In light of recent events, it might be wise to end that arrangement." "Thomas is improving," Jonathan said stiffly. "Even so, appearances matter now more than ever." Charles glanced toward Isaac, his expression hardening. "We can't afford to show any weakness, any crack in the natural order. The wrong message could be catastrophic." After Charles departed, Jonathan remained rooted in place, watching Thomas, Isaac, and Miss Porter under the magnolia tree. From a distance, they looked peaceful, harmonious, three humans engaged in simple, shared activities. The image filled him with both warmth and terror. That evening, Jonathan attended the meeting at the county courthouse. The room was packed with plantation owners, merchants, and community leaders, their faces grim in the lamplight. Reverend Parker opened with a prayer for divine protection against the forces of darkness that seek to destroy our Christian way of life. Then Judge Harrington, the committee chairman, took the floor. Gentlemen, the events at Harper's Ferry confirm our worst fears. The abolitionists are no longer content with pamphlets and speeches. They have turned to violence and insurrection. Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd. We must increase patrols, restrict slave movements, and thoroughly examine any strangers in our midst. The judge's gaze swept the room. We must also look inward to ensure no dangerous ideas take root in our community. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, aware of eyes turning toward him. Mr. Caldwell, the judge continued, there are reports of unusual arrangements on your plantation. A slave given inappropriate access to your son, a new governess with northern sensibilities. The room fell silent. Jonathan felt sweat gathering at his collar, despite the evening chill. My son's condition requires specialized care, he said carefully. The slave in question has shown a particular aptitude. Aptitude? Charles Whitfield interrupted. Jonathan, listen to yourself. These people aren't capable of the higher faculties you're attributing to this man. Isaac was helping my son when no one else could, Jonathan replied, an edge entering his voice. Judge Harrington leaned forward. And this new governess? Miss Porter, is it? What do we know of her background? She comes highly recommended from a respected family in Savannah, Jonathan said, though he realized he'd taken her references at face value, eager for someone who understood Thomas's needs. Nevertheless, the committee would like to review her credentials, the judge said. These are dangerous times, Mr. Caldwell. We cannot be too careful. As the meeting continued, Jonathan felt increasingly isolated. These men had been his friends and peers his entire life. They attended the same church, dined at each other's homes, shared the same values and interests. Yet now, a gulf seemed to be opening between them. All because he'd allowed Isaac to help Thomas, because he'd begun to question certainties they still held sacred. Walking home under a sky thick with stars, Jonathan made a decision. He would protect Thomas at all costs, but he would also protect Isaac, the man who had reached his son when no one else could, who had shown him a way forward when all paths seemed closed. The question was, could he do both in a world rapidly dividing into irreconcilable sides? When Jonathan returned to Willowbrook, the house was quiet. He checked on Thomas, finding him asleep, then headed to his study. To his surprise, Miss Porter was waiting, a letter in her hand. I apologize for the late hour, Mr. Caldwell, but this arrived for you while you were out. The messenger said it was urgent. Jonathan took the envelope, noting the Philadelphia postmark. Thank you, Miss Porter. She didn't leave. Instead, she closed the study door and spoke in a low voice. Mr. Caldwell, I should tell you something. I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my background. Jonathan tensed. Go on. I did study at the Perkins Institution in Boston, but I also worked with the Educational Commission for Freedmen. She met his eyes directly. I believe all children deserve education, regardless of their color or condition. The implications were clear. Miss Porter held abolitionist sympathies, the very ideology the community was now vigilant against. "Why are you telling me this?" Jonathan asked, though he suspected the answer. "Because I've seen how you interact with Isaac, how you value his insights about Thomas." Her voice softened. "You're not like the others, Mr. Caldwell. You see him as a person, not property." Jonathan should have dismissed her immediately. In the current climate, harboring someone with her views was dangerous. Yet he found himself saying, "You're mistaken about me, Miss Porter. I'm simply a father seeking help for his son." She smiled sadly. "Even if that were true, the help you've chosen speaks volumes." She moved toward the door, then paused. "The world is changing, Mr. Caldwell. Soon we'll all have to decide which side of history we wish to stand on." After she left, Jonathan opened the letter from Philadelphia. The doctor wrote that he was coming south to observe Thomas personally, a journey of considerable inconvenience that suggested genuine professional interest. He would arrive in 2 weeks' time. Jonathan should have felt only hope at this news. Instead, he felt a complicated mixture of emotions. The doctor might help Thomas, but his visit would also expose the unconventional arrangements at Willowbrook to outside scrutiny. And now, with Miss Porter's revelation, the risks had multiplied exponentially. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and moved to the window. In the distance, the lights of the slave quarters had long since gone dark. Somewhere out there, Isaac too lay awake, perhaps thinking of his lost son, perhaps wondering what tomorrow would bring in this increasingly precarious arrangement. The bourbon burned Jonathan's throat as a terrible clarity settled over him. He had allowed himself to exist in a middle space, questioning slavery enough to see Isaac's humanity, but not enough to reject the institution entirely. Using Isaac's knowledge while maintaining his ownership, benefiting from the system even as he began to doubt it. That middle space was vanishing. Harper's Ferry had seen to that. Now lines were being drawn, sides chosen, and Jonathan would soon be forced to decide where he and, by extension, Thomas and Isaac truly stood. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the darkness, its melancholy cry echoing unanswered across the plantation grounds. Jonathan finished his drink and prepared for bed, knowing sleep would likely elude him. In Charleston, John Brown awaited trial for treason. In Washington, politicians hurled accusations across an increasingly unbridgeable divide. And at Willowbrook, 3 souls balanced on a knife's edge of history, their private connection now entangled with the gathering storm of national conflict. The middle ground was disappearing beneath their feet. October brought cooler air and crimson leaves to Willowbrook, but no relief from the mounting tensions. John Brown's trial dominated conversations throughout the county, his forthcoming execution viewed as justice by some and martyrdom by others. Political debates grew heated as the presidential election approached, with Lincoln's name spoken like a curse in Southern drawing rooms. Against this backdrop, Dr. James Whitman arrived from Philadelphia. The physician was younger than Jonathan expected, barely 40, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a directness of manner uncommon in Southern society. "I appreciate your willingness to travel so far, Doctor," Jonathan said as they walked the grounds on the morning after Whitman's arrival. "Your letters intrigued me, Mr. Caldwell. Children like Thomas are my particular interest." Dr. Whitman paused, choosing his words carefully. "And I must admit, your mention of the slave who connects with your son presents a fascinating case study." Jonathan tensed. "Isaac has a unique understanding of Thomas's condition. Because his own son shared similar traits, Dr. Whitman said, surprising Jonathan with his insight. You mentioned it briefly in your third letter. Had he revealed that much? Jonathan couldn't recall. His correspondence with Dr. Whitman had become increasingly candid over the months, perhaps dangerously so. I'd like to observe them together, the doctor continued, and speak with Isaac directly, if possible. The request was reasonable, yet radical. A northern physician treating a slave as a source of medical knowledge rather than a subject. Jonathan hesitated only briefly before nodding. This afternoon, then. They usually work in the garden after Thomas's lessons. Dr. Whitman spent the morning examining Thomas, his approach gentler than previous physicians. He didn't force eye contact or demand verbal responses, instead observing Thomas's self-directed activities and occasionally joining them on the boy's terms. He has an extraordinary mind, Whitman remarked during lunch. Not lesser, as some might claim, but differently ordered. His attention to pattern and detail is remarkable. Miss Porter, joining them at Jonathan's invitation, nodded eagerly. I've been documenting his stone arrangements. There's mathematical precision to them. Relationships between colors and shapes that follow consistent rules. You've made detailed observations, Dr. Whitman said approvingly, examining her notebooks. This is exactly the kind of documentation that advances our understanding. Jonathan watched their animated discussion with mixed emotions. Their shared intellectual excitement was palpable and dangerous. In the current climate, such progressive ideas about education, about the mind, could easily be conflated with other radical notions. That afternoon, they gathered in the garden. Isaac was already there, preparing beds for winter vegetables, his strong hands working methodically through the soil. Straightened when he saw the group approaching, his expression carefully neutral despite what must have been apprehension at meeting a northern doctor. Thomas ran ahead, making his way directly to Isaac's side and beginning to arrange seed packets by color, without greeting or preamble. Isaac acknowledged him with the familiar humming that had become their private language. Remarkable, Dr. Whitman murmured, observing their easy interaction. He's completely comfortable. Over the next hour, the doctor watched Thomas and Isaac work side by side. He noted how Isaac anticipated Thomas's needs without words, how their movements fell into complementary rhythms, how Thomas occasionally looked toward Isaac's hands, never his face, for guidance. May I speak with you, Isaac? Dr. Whitman finally asked, approaching carefully to avoid disrupting Thomas's focus. Isaac glanced at Jonathan, who nodded permission. Yes, sir. How did you discover this approach with Thomas? Isaac's hands stilled on the garden tools. It was how I reached my son, sir. Benjamin didn't speak much either, but he understood rhythm, patterns. He needed quiet to think, got overwhelmed by too much at once. And you recognize these same traits in Thomas? Yes, sir. First time I saw him in the garden, moving like Benjamin used to. Something softened in Isaac's expression. Some folks think these children are empty. They're not. They're full, too full sometimes. World comes in too bright, too loud. Dr. Whitman nodded eagerly. That aligns with my observations of similar children. The sensory experience is different. More intense, perhaps less filtered. He hesitated, then asked, Your son, what became of him? Pain flickered across Isaac's features before the careful mask returned. Sold, sir. 3 years past. I'm sorry, Dr. Whitman said quietly, the words inadequate, yet sincere. The interaction was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jonathan turned to see Charles Whitfield and Judge Harrington riding up the main drive, their expressions grim. "Continue here," Jonathan told Dr. Whitman and Miss Porter. "I'll see what brings them." He intercepted the visitors before they reached the garden, but not before they'd observed the scene. The northern doctor conversing with a slave as an equal, the governess documenting their interaction, Thomas moving freely between them. "Jonathan," Judge Harrington said without preamble, "we need to speak privately." In Jonathan's study, the judge placed a letter on the desk. "This was sent to the Citizens Committee by your former governess, Miss Abigail Simmons. It contains disturbing allegations." Jonathan scanned the letter, his stomach knotting. Abigail described in damning detail the unnatural arrangement between Thomas and Isaac, Jonathan's excessive dependence on a slave's counsel, and her suspicions about Miss Porter's northern sympathies and dangerous ideas regarding the education of inferiors. "These are serious concerns, Jonathan," Charles said, his tone somber. "Especially now, with the election weeks away and tensions already high." Judge Harrington leaned forward. "We've also received reports about your current visitor, this Dr. Whitman. Are you aware he's published articles advocating education for colored children? That he's known to associate with abolitionist circles in Philadelphia?" Jonathan hadn't known, though he wasn't entirely surprised. "He's here as a physician, not a political agent. Thomas's condition—" "This goes beyond your son," the judge interrupted. "The community is watching, Jonathan. Your position, your family name, carries influence. The arrangements you've permitted at Willowbrook send a dangerous message." Charles's expression softened slightly. "We understand your concern for Thomas, but surely there are more appropriate methods than this. What exactly are you asking of me?" Jonathan's voice was steady despite his inner turmoil. "End this experiment," Judge Harrington said firmly. "Dismiss Miss Porter. We can recommend suitable replacements from proper Southern families. Send the doctor back north, and most importantly, remove that slave from any contact with your son." "And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air, its implications enormous. The judge's eyes hardened. "Then the committee would be forced to consider whether your judgment in all matters has become compromised, including management of this plantation and guardianship of your son." The threat was unmistakable. They could move to have him declared unfit, have Thomas institutionalized, have Willowbrook placed under different management. All perfectly legal, all devastating. "I'll consider your concerns," Jonathan said finally, neither agreeing nor refusing. After they departed, Jonathan remained in his study, the weight of decision heavy upon him. Outside, he could see Dr. Whitman and Miss Porter still in the garden with Thomas and Isaac. They looked peaceful, purposeful. A small community united by concern for one unusual boy. A community that could not exist in the world as it was. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Jonathan called Dr. Whitman, Miss Porter, and Isaac to his study. The unlikely gathering, master, physician, governess, and slave, seemed to embody the impossible contradictions of his situation. "The Citizens Committee has raised concerns about our arrangements here," Jonathan began without preamble. "They view Dr. Whitman's presence and Miss Porter's methods as potentially subversive, and they insist that Isaac have no further contact with Thomas." Miss Porter's face flushed with indignation. "That's absurd. Thomas has made remarkable progress. Surely they can see." "They see what they fear," Dr. Whitman interrupted quietly. "A world changing beneath their feet." Isaac remained silent, his eyes lowered, though tension radiated from his still form. Jonathan paced before the fireplace. They've threatened to take action if I don't comply. Action that could separate me from Thomas, that could place him in an institution. What will you do? Miss Porter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan stopped pacing, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. Dr. Whitman, I must ask you to return to Philadelphia tomorrow. Your presence here has become untenable. The doctor nodded, unsurprised. I understand. Miss Porter, you should prepare to leave as well. I'll provide excellent references. No, she interrupted firmly. I won't abandon Thomas now. Not when he's finally beginning to connect with the world. It's not safe for you here, Jonathan insisted. Few worthwhile things are safe, Mr. Caldwell. Her chin lifted in defiance. I'll stay until you physically remove me. Jonathan turned finally to Isaac, the most vulnerable person in the room, the one with the most to lose. Isaac, I understand, Master Caldwell, Isaac said quietly. I'll keep my distance from young Master Thomas. The simple acquiescence broke something in Jonathan's heart. Isaac would comply because he had no choice, because resistance meant punishment, perhaps sale, separation from any hope of finding his own son. No, Jonathan said, surprising himself and everyone in the room. No, that's not what I'm asking. He moved to his desk and withdrew a stack of papers from a locked drawer. I've been considering this for some time. Recent events have simply accelerated my decision. He placed the papers before them, manumission documents for Isaac, already completed but unsigned. Beside them lay deeds transferring a small property in Ohio to Jonathan's name, and a substantial bank draft. I can't continue this way, Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he proposed. Living in contradiction, recognizing your humanity, your intelligence, Isaac, while maintaining your enslavement. Using your knowledge while denying your freedom. Isaac stared at the papers, disbelief etched on his features. I'm offering you freedom, Jonathan continued, and means to establish yourself in Ohio. Perhaps even, he hesitated, to search for Benjamin. The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire. What Jonathan proposed wasn't simply unusual. It was revolutionary, a rejection of the very foundations of Southern society. If discovered, it would confirm every accusation against him and worse. Why? Isaac finally asked, the single word containing volumes. Jonathan considered the question carefully. Because Thomas needs you. Because you deserve freedom. Because I can no longer reconcile what I know to be right with how we live. Dr. Whitman leaned forward, his expression grave. Have you considered the consequences, Mr. Caldwell? For yourself and Thomas? I have another property, Jonathan replied. In Massachusetts, inherited from my mother's family. Small but sufficient. Thomas and I could relocate there, away from all this. The plan had formed gradually over months of internal conflict, crystallizing only as he spoke it aloud. Leave Willowbrook. Leave Georgia. Take Thomas north, where his condition might be viewed with more understanding than disgust, where Isaac could visit freely, perhaps even continue helping Thomas while searching for his own son. It would mean abandoning everything, Dr. Whitman said quietly. Your position, your heritage. Some heritages are better abandoned, Jonathan replied, the words treasonous in Georgia, but true nonetheless. Miss Porter's eyes shone with unexpected tears. When would you go? Soon. After the election, regardless of outcome. The country stands at a precipice. We all feel it. I want Thomas somewhere safe when Whatever comes, comes. Isaac finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Master Caldwell, Mr. Caldwell, this risk you're taking is necessary, Jonathan finished, and long overdue. Outside, an owl called into the night, its mournful cry echoing across Willowbrook's grounds. Within weeks, this place that had been home to generations of Caldwells might be left behind. The land would remain, the crops would grow under different management. But the people who had shared this improbable connection would be gone, scattered like leaves before the coming storm. We have preparations to make, Jonathan said, his voice stronger now that the decision was made. Dr. Whitman, your return to Philadelphia as planned will avoid suspicion. Miss Porter, if you're truly committed to staying, we'll need your help with Thomas during the transition. He turned lastly to Isaac. The choice is yours. The documents are ready whenever you decide. Isaac looked up, meeting Jonathan's eyes directly for perhaps the first time. I'll need to find Benjamin. We'll help you, Jonathan promised, whatever it takes. As the unlikely allies began forming their plans, a weight lifted from Jonathan's shoulders, the weight of living divided against himself. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and sacrifice. But for the first time since he'd watched Isaac connect with Thomas in the garden months ago, Jonathan felt the clarity of purpose that comes from aligning belief with action. Willowbrook would soon be part of his past. But Thomas's future, and Isaac's, now held possibilities previously unimaginable. Freedom, healing, perhaps even happiness. Outside, autumn leaves drifted from ancient oaks, their falling a reminder that some endings are necessary for new beginnings. The nation stood at its own crossroads, hurtling toward a conflict that would redefine its very soul. But in this room, on this night, 4 people had already chosen their path forward, together, into uncertainty, but with the courage of conviction lighting their way.